Do you remember your past life? I don't. I'll be honest, I don't. And most of us don't. But many of us do believe, or are ready to believe, or wonder at least, about reincarnation. The marriage or the link between what the ancient Vedic or Vaishnava scriptures of ancient India have to say about survival after death, about consciousness, about memory, seem to provide a very fitting paradigm, or a very fitting paradigm, context, or model in which the rogue phenomena, and I'll describe what that means, the rogue phenomena, among others, which we'll describe also briefly, of children who claim, or children who spontaneously claim to remember past lives, fits very, very, very well. Now, these children who claim to remember their past lives are part of a broader material, which more and more scientists talk about, such as one of my favorites is Edward Kelly. He edited this huge book that came out about 15 years ago called Mind for the 21st Century, like I think a 1,000 page or 2,000 page book, going over all the different kind of rogue phenomena, or all the kinds of phenomena that escape typical standard classical physicalist definitions of the world. And we'll get into what that means. But what am I talking about when I talk about these rogue phenomena? For example, levitation. Levitation, as is ascertained and researched and, let's say, spoken about, witnessed in the Catholic Church, also in certain Buddhist traditions. You have this idea of stigmata, of phenomena of very devout Christians developing, blood clots or blood dripping on the palm of their hands because of thinking so much of the crucifix and the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, where he bled. I'm talking about mediums, people who are able to lift physical objects, who basically go against the law of gravity, go walk through walls, and so on. Psi phenomena, out-of-body experiences, near-death experiences, and of course, as I said, children who claim to remember their past lives. These are all rogue phenomena. What's a rogue phenomenon? It's basically a phenomena that goes against the grain, that behaves in ways or in a way that is contrary to the accepted and expected way of functioning, especially in what I mentioned earlier, this physicalism model of reality. So what is physicalism? Well, basically, in terms of, consciousness and children who remember their past lives, for example, it can be defined simply as, that belief which claims that the mind and personality and consciousness are nothing more than byproducts of brain activity encased within our skulls and which vanish at death. Right? So what's the connection? What's the link between these rogue phenomena and the teachings of ancient India, the teachings of specific spiritual texts which have been accepted as revealed knowledge, transcendental knowledge, spiritual knowledge for thousands of years by literally millions upon millions, if not billions of people. Specifically the Bhagavad-Gita and the Bhagavad Purana, or the Srimad Bhagavatam, right? So here we're going to basically look at the Bhagavad-Gita and the Bhagavatam and the kind of model they propose to make sense of this rogue phenomena of children who claim to remember their past lives. Now, this phenomena was studied really for the first time in a very serious way, in a very serious academic, rigorous way, by someone quite famous called Ian Stevenson. Ian Stevenson, who passed away not too long ago. He passed away on February 8th, 2007. Now, Ian Stevenson was not just some, amateur scientist. He was the head, literally the head of the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Virginia. And for those of you who know or may not know, the University of Virginia, along perhaps with the University of California, is probably the top or second best public university in the entire United States of America. And he was the head of the psychiatry department. And what's specific about him, or what's special about him, is that he somehow or other made his entire career revolve around children who claim to remember their past lives. That was his whole work. His life's work was to look and to examine literally thousands upon thousands of cases, and he wrote more than 20 books of children who spontaneously remembered, allegedly, a past life, and very specific details of a past life. One of his last books, if not the last book, if I'm not mistaken, was a book called European Cases of the Reincarnation Type. And what I find really interesting in this is that, as you probably expect, there's a lot of naysayers. There's a lot of people who are opposed categorically, without even looking at the phenomena carefully, to any idea of, survival of the mind or of consciousness after death, and therefore who trivialize, marginalize the whole concept, the whole research, as being nothing but pseudoscience, something not to be taken seriously at all, right? And one of the, counter arguments to children, for example, who claim to remember their past lives is, these kids mostly come from Asia. And in Asia, there's this commonly accepted idea that reincarnation is a scientific fact. And therefore, it's really easy for a kid to make up some story of a past life, because the belief in a past life is so central to the DNA of that culture, or those South Asian cultures or Asian cultures in general, that it's really easy. But the fact of the matter is, as Ian Stevenson pointed out, and as more and more cases show more and more today, and going into the future, this phenomena of kids who spontaneously remember a past lives is not a monopoly of Asia. And as this last book of Ian Stevenson shows, there's cases in Europe, in North America. We'll look at one in particular. So that would debunk the counter argument that, it's just a cultural thing. Ian Stevenson began an institute which continues on today, which has changed the name, but is still at the University of Virginia, and is now under the able guidance of Jim Tucker. And it's called the Division of Perceptual Studies at the University of Virginia. And they have publications and conferences and videos and all sorts of material explaining and giving references and showing the world case after case after case of children who remember their past lives. And this is, when you click on their about and what they're about, this is what they say. Read this. Through its research, the Department of Perceptual Studies strives to challenge this entrenched mainstream view. And what is this entrenched mainstream view? It is this view that I described a few slides up, namely this idea that consciousness and personality is nothing but neurons and protons in the brain, right? How? By rigorously evaluating empirical evidence suggesting that consciousness survives death and that mind and brain are distinct and separable. And so they look at these cases, case after case after case, and as Ian Stevenson did openly in his books, he was not a religious man, he didn't ascribe to any particular, faith, so to speak, but he openly said, and the Department of, Perceptual Studies openly says as well, that reincarnation, and sorry for the accent on the E here, this is from my French presentation, that reincarnation is the best plausible explanation, theoretically, for these children who remember their past lives. Reincarnation, the survival of a specific individual conscious self going into another physical body, is the best explanation out there. Now, for a scientific body, for a body of scientists, tenured professors at a public university, at the university, at the United States of America, to say this is very, very telling of how times are changing and how we're witnessing basically a sort of a revolution in a big paradigm shift in terms of a reconciliation, as Edward Kelly would say, of science and spirituality. So now, if you will, let's go and look at one particular case. This is the case of James Leiniger. We're going to watch an ABC special, which I cut into a 3-minute little clip in a few slides. But just in brief, this kid claimed, he's about 20 years old now, but when he was 3 or 4, he was having these nightmares, and every nightmare was the same. It was a nightmare of him being killed in a plane, which got shot down by enemy fire, the Japanese in this case, and which fell to the sea and exploded, and that's how he died. And so he claimed that he was in a past life, the conductor or the pilot of a particular plane, a guy whose name was also James. The kid would draw these little, sketches of war, of his plane being shot down. And when his parents were, Christians, they come from the Bible Belt. I forgot if it's Mississippi or Alabama or Tennessee, but it's definitely one of those states where reincarnation is not, accepted as mainstream. When his parents started asking him for more details, he started giving specific names. For example, the name of the naval fighting ship from which his plane would take off, the Natoma Bay. Anyway, images speak 1,000 words. So here's the clip, and watch and listen to this. It's about 3 minutes long.
On March 3rd, 1945, a 21-year-old Navy fighter pilot on a mission over the Pacific was shot down by Japanese artillery. His name might well have been forgotten, were it not for the remarkable, some might say unbelievable story of a little boy named James.
He was obsessed with airplanes. If you look around the house, that's all you'll see: airplanes, helicopters, aircraft carriers.
But then, when he was 2, the planes James loved suddenly began to give him frequent and frightening nightmares.
I'd wake him up and he'd be screaming, and he'd always be laying on his back, kicking his feet up at the ceiling. And I'd say, "Baby, what were you dreaming about?" And he'd say, "Airplane crash on fire, little man can't get out." I talked to my mom about it. A lot of times my mom had said maybe he's remembering a past life.
What did you say?
Politely, baloney.
Here's James at age 3, going over a plane as if he's doing a pre-flight check. He would continue to say and do things that were puzzling, like the time his mom bought him a toy airplane.
And I said, "Oh, look, there's a bomb on the bottom of it." He said, "That's not a bomb, Mama, that's a drop tank."
A drop tank?
I'd never heard of a drop tank. I didn't know what a drop tank was.
Bruce was deeply skeptical.
He said, "There has to be a logical explanation."
I don't believe in past lives. I don't believe in this stuff.
Bruce said, "What happened to your plane?" He said, "It crashed on fire." And Bruce said, "Why did your airplane crash?" And he said, "It got shot." And Bruce said, "Well, who shot your plane?" And I'll never forget the look on his face. He went, "The Japanese."
Still, despite these extraordinary stories, Bruce remained dubious, almost to prove they couldn't be true. He began to piece together the details James was sharing. And what he found, he says, shook him to the core. For in many instances, the stories appeared to match the facts. James seemed to be recalling real events, real people, in the life of a man who'd been dead for almost 60 years.
Another night, Bruce had come in and he said, "Do you remember where your plane took off?" And he said, "It took off of a boat." "Do you remember the name of your boat?" "Natoma." "Do you remember what your name was?" And he'd always say, "James." But his name is James. It never really occurred to us. We thought he just wasn't understanding the question. So I said, "Do you remember any friends or anyone else that you flew with?" And he said, Jack Larson.
Bruce began doing some research. Almost immediately, he discovered that the Natoma was an actual ship, a small aircraft carrier in the Pacific called the Natoma Bay. And Jack Larson, the Navy buddy little James recalled? Well, it turns out there was a pilot named Jack Larson who served aboard the Natoma Bay. In fact, he's alive and well and living in Arkansas.
And it was like, holy mackerel. I mean, really, you could have poured my brains out of my ears. And I just couldn't believe it.
One day, while leafing through a new book about the Battle of Iwo Jima, Bruce turned to an aerial photo of the Pacific Island. James was seated nearby.
He pointed to it and he goes, "Daddy, that's where my airplane was shot down." And I said, "What?" "That's my airplane got shot down there, Daddy." And I just went blank. I couldn't say anything.
By then, Bruce had become a man possessed, searching the internet, combing through military records, and interviewing men who served aboard the Natoma Bay. Finally, a breakthrough. he learned that there was just one pilot from the squadron killed at Iwo Jima. That pilot, James M. Houston Jr.
You know, my meter of skepticism was starting to go over toward belief.
When little James would describe being shot down, he told of how his plane had sustained a direct hit on the engine.
We had an airplane, and I said, well, can you show me where it was? And he pointed right up to the front of the engine.
That's what makes this man's story so intriguing. His name is Ralph Klarber. Klarber was a rear gunner on a TBM Avenger that flew off the Natoma Bay. On March 3rd, 1945, he took part in a raid near Iwo Jima. As it happens, Klarber's plane was right next to the one flown by James M. Houston Jr.
I saw the hit. I would say he was hit head on. Yeah, right on the middle of the engine.
Just as little James had described it.
So what do you believe now about your son James?
I believe that he had a past life. I believe that in his past life he was James M. Houston Jr.
So this case takes place in America, has nothing to do with Asia. The details of this kid, the details that this kid talks about are so astounding that, I mean, they should theoretically convince even the most skeptic of the same conclusion that James's father concludes right now at the end of this video, where he's like, I believe that this kid was so-and-so in a past life. So this is just one among thousands of cases. There's many more thousand cases, but many of them are what Ian Stevenson would call not confirmed, because there's precisely too much leeway for a possible insertion of some information, or there's just, it's not airtight enough in terms of the kid being, able to repeat something he heard or he saw on TV, or in other words, you get my point. But what he and Jim Tucker and his team, when they call these cases confirmed cases, their conclusion again is that reincarnation is the most feasible explanation. What I really like are cases which include birthmarks. There's one case in particular that took place in the Druze community in Israel. They're a special kind of community because even though they're sort of an offshoot of Islam, they believe in reincarnation, funny enough. And so there's this one kid who was born with a birth defect, a mark on the skin of his head, a very clear vertical line. And he claimed when he was 3 or 4 years old, as typically these kids are when they start remembering past life memories, that he had been killed by someone, and he gave the specific name of the person. And he said that this specific person had killed him by hitting him with the edge of an axe on his head. And that's how he had killed him. And that he had buried his body in a particular place in the forest. As the story goes, and as described by, it's either Ian Stevenson or by Jim Tucker, they got to hear about the case. They interviewed the kid. The kid actually walked them to the forest spot where the kid says, he was killed in his past body. They dug up in that area, and sure enough, they found a human skeleton. And the skull of the skeleton had a broken skull. Like the skull was broken from a hit of what could have only been an axe. Corresponding specifically to the kid's memory and to the kid's birthmark. And they spoke to the guy the kid claimed, had killed him. And according to the story, according to the report, this guy actually admitted. He acknowledged that he had killed that person. So we got thousands of these cases. And our duty, let's say in this presentation, is to try to find out which model fits this rogue phenomena best? Which model accommodates this rogue phenomena best? And so as we've seen briefly, the model, which is sort of the mainstream scientific model of today, which can be called physicalism, does not present an adequate fit for this rogue phenomena. For example, Francis Crick, one of the founders of having mapped out the human DNA, he, in typical physicalist fashion, claimed, quote, you your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. Right? That's all we are. Consciousness, feelings, emotions can all be reduced to neurons and protons, basically. And as Marvin Minsky, a famous computer scientist, engineer who also died recently, said, we are meat computers. That's all we are. And our consciousness, our behavior can be reduced and understood simply by the mechanical laws of physics, biology, and chemistry. And when someone is actually clinically dead, when someone is brain dead, there is no such thing of a survival of anything beyond death. That's it. That's all there is. When death comes, when clinical death comes, when brain death comes, there is no more self, there is no more consciousness. What to speak of it, that consciousness going into another body, right? And yet, this rogue phenomena seems to point in that direction. So we clearly have a problem with the physicalist paradigm. So now, without being, too botchy and insulting and making too many generalizations, I'll very briefly touch upon Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. My academic, my little bit of academic studies I did at the University of California at Oxford for my master's were both in religious and comparative religion. So, I certainly am no great expert, but I have studied enough to have enough confidence in the following things I'll say without, again, making too many oversimplified generalizations. If we're going to talk about mainstream Christianity, mainstream Christianity, and once again, sorry for the word christianisme, this is for my French presentation, I forgot to change it into English. If we're talking about, general mainstream Christianity, I don't think there'll be many who will oppose this claim, and namely that, basically speaking, in Christianity, there's really no room for reincarnation. There's really no room for reincarnation. I mean, Christians are supposed to follow the Bible as, the Word of God, right? Supposed to, or at least most Christians do. And in Hebrews 9:27, there's this famous statement, just as people are destined to die once, and after that to face judgment, right? I told you I went to Oxford, and one of my papers, as they call them, one of the papers I wrote for my master's degree was to look at the teachings of Origen, Origen, one of the founding fathers of the church, and his, did he teach reincarnation as is commonly understood today or not? That paper you can actually find online. It was published. It was actually my only academic publication so far in my life, and it's called Pop Reincarnation, looking at whatever we have available about reincarnation from the teachings of Origen. And why did I choose him? Because if you do a Google search today and you type Christianity reincarnation, you'll find really sort of not very rigorous entries, not very rigorous in the sense of an academic rigor, websites saying that, early Christians believe in reincarnation, and the proof is that Origen definitely taught it. So I want to sort of confirm that popularly accepted claim, and I would have been very happy, because, I believe in reincarnation. So I would have been very happy to see that Origen actually, taught that. And the fact is that a lot of Origen's writings are no longer available. Many of them were burnt. And so my conclusion, my reluctant conclusion after, doing extensive research on Origen's teachings on this topic, is that from whatever we have left of Origen's teachings, they may, you could make an argument that our Origen believed in the pre-existence of the soul. In other words, that the soul existed before the body was created, but not, unfortunately, in the existence of an actual spiritual self that survives physical death and that actually wholly reincarnates, into another physical body, as is commonly understood and as is taught, as we'll see, in the Bhagavad-Gita. We can't even make that argument. So overall, speaking, in terms of the Christian worldview, even when you dig into Origen's teachings, what to speak of mainstream Christianity, what to speak of the Bible, there's just no room for this idea of reincarnation. and not just the idea of reincarnation, but the very notion of who the soul is and what the soul is and who we are in relationship to the soul is very different. And I'll give you an example. My father, my late father, who passed away 6 years ago, that's me on the right, on his last stroll in the Jardin de Luxembourg in Paris. When he passed away, he grew up with the Jesuits, but he was never religious at all. He was more of a skeptic. Skeptic. But my brother, my older brother from his first wife, is still, quite Catholic. So he insisted that there would be a funeral, a Catholic funeral. So we did that at the Église, the church, the Église Sainte-Geneviève, near the Panthéon in the 5th district of Paris. And before the funeral, a few days before, I had a meeting with the priest of the parish, and I told him, listen, I also am a priest. I'm ordained. You can call me a priest or a pastor. I've been ordained in 1997 in the monotheistic, Vedic tradition, and as is customary for someone from the family to say a few words, I'd like to have the permission to speak a few words. I'll quote a few verses from the Bible about the eternality of the soul, and I'll also like to quote just 1 or 2 verses from the Bhagavad-Gita. And this is the verse I was going to quote. For the soul there is never birth nor death, nor having once been does he ever cease to be. He is unborn, eternal, ever existing, undying and primeval. He is not slain when the body is slain. The priest refused. I was quite disappointed. And when the actual mass, the funeral mass came around, we were all, standing in the pews, and the priest was standing, facing us with our father's open coffin right in front, said the following words. And I remember he was definitely speaking about me. He said, ladies and gentlemen, we have learned from the ancient Greeks, and then the question is, of course, who did they learn it from? But that's another topic. We have learned from the ancient Greeks that the soul is eternal. But as Catholics, we do believe that I don't know if he used the word ontologically, but he meant to say ontologically. We ontologically are not just spiritual. We are, our body is an integral part of our identity, And so when he said that, I was like, okay, we have a difference. And so, and this notion of, we being a mixture or a common ground between these 3 categories, spirit, soul, and body, has shaped Western civilization like nobody's business. Like we can't even conceive how deeply rooted this idea, even in secular Western society, this, how do you say, like a division of 3 parts, tripartite division of the self, being, spirit, soul, and body, or, 33% of each, is really deeply rooted. And just for your information, that concept, which is so, widespread in Western society, finds its roots in actually a letter that Paul wrote to the Thessalonians in the Bible. In 5:23 of Thessalonians, Paul writes to the Thessalonians and says this famous saying, "May your whole spirit, soul, and body be kept blameless at the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ." Right? So if we are even 33% body, then who transmigrates into another body? Right? It's clearly not the physical body that transmigrates again into another physical body. Right? So that paradigm is problematic. And as I quoted just before, the Bible is, the Word of God and so on. And there's this famous saying in Hebrew 9:27, just as people are destined to die once, there's a judgment after death, right? And after only one life. So we got a problem with the Christian model. Now, very briefly, the next 2 models. We got Islam and Judaism. In Islam, from my limited research, there's very little about reincarnation. The general understanding is that no, you only live once. Again, there's a few exceptions here and there who may point to some, some passage in the Quran or in the Hadiths. But generally speaking, the mainstream idea is that you only live once, right? In Judaism, generally speaking, again, also, you only live once. I want to share with you something that a Jewish professor at the University of California, when I was studying there, Barbara Holdridge, told me. which is very significant. She's a Jewish professor of Hinduism, actually, and her thesis at Harvard University was a comparison of the Torah and the Vedas, and specifically she did work with Vaishnavism. She was actually quite friends with Tamal Krishna, the late Tamal Krishna Goswami, and she knows Krishna Kshetra Swami. She's friends with Hridayananda Goswami, Garuda Prabhu. These are all scholars in the field. And so she told me one day, I remember when I spoke to her, we were just having some sort of chit chat, and I spoke to her about reincarnation, and I asked her, I said, in Judaism, even in the sort of the esoteric part of Judaism, in what's called the Kabbalah, right? Isn't there mention of reincarnation? And I'll always remember her reaction. She chuckled as if she was kind of ashamed or embarrassed. And with a smile, she said, because, she knew where I was coming from. I was coming from the point of view of a Gaudiya Vaishnava who believes not only in the existence of the soul, but in the existence of the soul as being the self and being way beyond, completely transcendental to any sort of bodily designation, such as, Hindu, Buddhist, Christian, Muslim, black, white, woman, man, etc., etc. So she smiled and chuckled, and she said, embarrassingly, she said, actually, to tell you the truth, when you actually dig into it, even in the Kabbalah, there's this accepted idea that the Jewish soul is special. Is special. Like there is a difference. And I said, so they believe that Jewish souls are different ontologically from all other kinds of souls? And she chuckled. She said, yeah. So anyway, that's, a topic for discussion. Are all souls, spiritually equal in terms of quality, or is there such a thing as a Jewish soul? I certainly don't believe it, but suffice it to say that mainstream Judaism doesn't provide, I would claim, with respect, but still firmly, a very adequate, what to speak of, very sophisticated model to accommodate this rogue phenomena of children who claim to remember their past lives. So now, before going to the Vedic paradigm, which I think is the winner in this, if we would call it a competition, we have Buddhism, and putting aside, for example, the more theistic type of Buddhisms like Pure Land Buddhism. When you look at mainstream Zen Buddhism or Tibetan Buddhism, there is the idea of the possibility of a child remembering their past lives, very much so, and that is found, for example, in the tradition, in the custom of discovering, and I don't know how they do it, by some sort of astrological calculation or God knows what, finding out where the next Lama has taken birth. This is exemplified in a scene in the 1993 Martin Scorsese movie called Kundun, where there's this little kid born in some remote little tiny village in Tibet, and there's a Lama disguised as a peasant or as a villager, just an ordinary man who comes to his house, and just because he has a hunch, he has a feeling that this kid is the Lama, and the kid recognizes him as a Lama, and then so he subsequently comes back to the kid and presents him with 3 different options of about 5 different objects. So 3 different canes, 3 different eyeglasses, 3 different begging bowls, 3 different chopsticks, and one in each set used to belong to the original, to the old Lama. And so the kid is given an option to choose which one belonged to that old Lama or which one belonged to him. Here's the scene. Here's the clip.
This is mine.
I will give it to you if you know who I am.
Lama. Mine.
No, Hamu. Give it back. I'm sorry, he doesn't usually do such things. Uncle.
那时候他跟你去天下舞。
Tessa. He always says he wants to go to Tessa. Hamu.
Thank you for joining us. You say this is yours? What else belongs to you? Those are yours. Yes, those are yours.
This is mine. Mine.
Yes, Kunde.
So here we see the equivalent, the sort of the Buddhist equivalent of Ian Stevenson and company's work. There's a kid, and somehow they figure out, or they confirm, the case is confirmed, in case A, that, the kid really was someone else in the past life, because the details that this kid presents are so specific and beyond any type of doubt that there's just no possibility, no other way to explain it, or that he is the incarnation of the previous Lama. I want to open and close a tiny parenthesis here, because there is this common idea among mainstream Buddhists, which I find problematic and contradictory, and that is this idea of anatma, the doctrine of literally of no soul, like, no violence, ahimsa, so no soul, anatma. And Buddhists openly, and without shame, claim that unlike the followers of the Vedic tradition or the Vaishnavas, they do not accept the existence of an irreducible unit of spiritual consciousness, an actual person, right? Not to speak of a supreme person or a supreme being or God. Here is the Dalai Lama speaking with Gaur Gopal Das, a famous Gaudiya Vaishnav monk from Bombay, and he, admits as such.
Now here, Atma and Anatma theory. You believe Atma. Buddhists believe Anatma theory.
So he says, Buddhists believe in the Atma theory. So one question that we should bring up, and that I'd like to bring up, it's a philosophical question. And we'll close the parenthesis and go on to the final contestant, so to speak, in terms of our worldviews in our search to find the most accommodating one for the rogue phenomena of children who claim to remember their past lives. If there is no irreducible person, right, who survives the physical death and who goes into another body, then who is accountable for the karma that is created in one body? In other words, there's reactions, there's karmic reactions. There's karmic reactions. You do something good that gives pleasure to others, you will receive that pleasure in this life or in the next life. You do something that hurts others, you will suffer the same consequences, if not worse, in this life or in the next life. So when you're talking about you, then it makes sense. It makes sense. There's an actual person who survives physical death, a spiritual person, and that person, through the agency of a physical body, performs certain actions which have their good or bad reactions, and those reactions are experienced by that same spiritual entity in the next physical body. That's all. That makes sense, at least to me. But if there is no soul, if we're really talking about the notion of anatma, then again, who is responsible for the karma? Who inherits the karma in the next life? And that's, I think, a very big problem in Buddhist non-theistic philosophy. So now, as I said, let's move to the next paradigm, the Vedic paradigm, coming from the word Vedas. And in particular, as I said at the beginning, we're going to talk specifically about the Bhagavad-Gita and the Srimad Bhagavatam. And we're going to look at a few key verses. We're going to look at the process of transmigration, how an actual conscious being transmigrates, and what would be the explanation, for example, birthmarks in the next body or memories of a past life. And then we're going to look at one famous story, the story of King Bharata and Jadbharat, told in the Bhagavad Purana. So just to define a few terms, we dealt with this idea of Atma as opposed to Anatma. So here we're definitely talking about a paradigm which accepts the existence of an irreducible person, an actual soul, a spiritual being inside the body. And that Atma is often quoted in the Bhagavad-Gita as Purusha, or Dehi, the embodied who? The embodied Purusha, the embodied person, the embodied spiritual being. But generally speaking, throughout the Vedic traditions, regardless of which specific tradition you ascribe to, there's this common basic understanding, which I think which we can claim is common to all, sub-traditions, and that is this idea that unlike us being, 66%, soul, or 33% soul, or we are 100% soul. And therefore, this famous saying from the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, Aham Brahmasmi, I am Brahman. And Brahman, as we know, means spirit. I, as a self, am 100% spiritual. I am a soul inside a body. Or as C.S. Lewis is strangely attributed as having said, and I say that because he was a very devout Christian, and it's sort of not very... it's very common for a Christian to say this, but suffice it to say, he has been, for better or for worse, attributed as having said this famous quote, "You don't have a soul, you are a soul. You have a body," right? So this notion that we are 100% spiritual beings, we are eternal. It's not that we have a soul, but that we are souls, is just as a small little, another parenthesis here we'll take in the world of pop culture and pop music, specifically pop music of the 1970s and 80s, where this actually it corresponds to when this notion of us being souls was really popularized big time with the help of of modern technology, of printing presses and books, specifically I would say by the followers of A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, who distributed by the millions and millions and millions copies of the Bhagavad-Gita, which claims, or each copy did claim, that, or you get my point, which the Bhagavad-Gita claims, or each copies in general claim, that the soul is eternal. Here's John Lennon, the famous musician, ex-Beatle at this time, singing this song, Instant Karma, where the chorus is, "We all shine on."
Why in the world are we here? Surely not to live in pain and fear. Why on earth are you there? When you're everywhere, gonna get your share. But we all shine on, like the moon and the
we all shine on. Hey, I'm a soul, I'm eternal. The last little example is Sting, the famous Sting and the Police. They wrote a song back in the, I think, early 90s, maybe late 80s, called We Are Spirits in the Material World. And again, that concept totally goes back to this idea of Aham Brahmasmi. I am eternal, I am spiritual, I am a soul. Here's the chorus.
We are spirits in the material world. Our spirits in the material world. Our spirits in the material world. Our spirits in the material world.
As a funny anecdote, a disciple of Prabhupada, Prithu Prabhu, told me once, basically in the year 2000, 2001 in Los Angeles, he told me in passing, we were talking about Sting, and he said, you know, he told me with his German accent, I was in Ireland once, and Sting, I met Sting, and he asked me, so what's your philosophy? What's the philosophy of the Bhagavad-Gita? And I thought for a while, and then I told him, well, we are spirits in the material world. And then he looked at me and he said, and so he turned around, speaking of Sting, he turned around, made this hugely successful song, which made him millions of dollars, and he never gave me 1 cent for it. As Paul's letter to the Thessalonians, this idea of, being part soul, part spirit, part mind, or part body, is, very strongly felt within the DNA of Western civilization. This idea that we are souls, that we're 100% souls, is becoming more and more strong, as we've seen with these songs. Just as far back as only a month ago, Novak Djokovic, the number one tennis player in the world, said this when they told him about some tweeter comment by Andy Roddick about him being such a competitive guy who takes away someone's soul. And listen to what he says at the very end.
Think about this, quote from Andy Roddick. Some of you played a lot. He says, Novak first takes out your legs, then he takes out your soul.
Thanks, Andy. I take that as a compliment. Only the first part. The second part, I don't take anybody's soul. Everyone has their soul. We are all beautiful souls. So I appreciate everyone. We are all beautiful souls. We are all beautiful souls. We are all beautiful.
Significant, isn't it? We are all beautiful souls. It's no accident that Novak Djokovic, we hear, is coached by Jay Shetty, who is a practicing Vaishnava and like that. So this idea again of being souls inside a body, an embodied soul. As a small little pun, there's a Mexican meat preparation called chile con carne. Well, technically, we can say that we are almas or atmas con carne. And these almas con carne, which means, a soul with meat. Carne means meat. So we're not chilies with meat, but we're souls with meat, which are, our physical bodies have been reincarnating, in the cycle of samsara, birth after birth after birth after birth after birth. And the soul is in a different body every, 7 years. Heraclitus from ancient Greece used to say you can't step in the same river twice. So similarly, we could say you cannot step in the same body twice, right? Because the body changes all the time. But as the Bhagavad-Gita claims, there is a Purusha, an embodied soul that is eternal, that remains the same inside the body. And specifically about reincarnation, and changing bodies, the Bhagavad-Gita 2:22 has this to say, this famous verse, Vasamsi jirnani yata vihaya, navani grinati naroparani, tata sharirani vihaya jirnanyanyanya samyati navani dehi. That just as a person puts on new garments, giving up old ones, similarly the soul accepts new material bodies, giving up the old and useless ones, right? So this seems to fit, again, very well the rogue phenomena of children who claim to remember their past lives. There's an actual person, a spiritual person, a soul, right, who accepts a new material body. Just as you put on or you take off an old piece of cloth or an old shirt and you put on a new one, right? Now, to be more specific, this is where it kind of gets juicy for those who may already be really familiar with what we just said during the last hour. Here we get a little bit more specific and juicy. According to the Vaishnava paradigm, the self, the soul, that individual spark, has two bodies, two physical bodies actually. Not just the gross body, the outer body, which is, the body that we see, the skin color, the eye color, the hair, and so on. But there's a subtle body, which is invisible to the naked eye. And that subtle body is made of intelligence, mind, and false ego, right? The analogy of like an undershirt that you wear and then you put on a coat on top, right? So the coat on top is the gross body, and the subtle, body inside, which is the immediate covering of the soul, is that yellow undershirt. And according to the Bhagavad-Gita, when transmigration takes place, when the body, the gross body, right, the outer shell dies, the soul is transported into another gross physical body by the subtle body. In other words, and this is significant, the subtle body stays with the soul. The subtle body continues to cover the soul, even though the gross body has been taken off and a new body comes on, right? So that's important to note, because here is where we could say is where the memories take place. And here I'd like to introduce a notion called samskara, which in Sanskrit could be translated as a mental impression, a mental memory, a psychological imprint. For example, and this is not a good example because obviously we don't promote or condone drinking alcohol, but for example, if someone gets drunk one night and next morning he has a hangover, and that hangover consists of impressions and sort of blurred memories, right, of what happened or what he did when he was completely drunk the night before. So in a similar way, this notion of samskara is it can be compared to that, an impression on the subtle, body, the subtle body, an impression that's made on the subtle body from some sort of impact or effect on the gross level. For example, and this is a tragic example, but we know that victims of child abuse, for example, victims of rape, victims of war crimes, have, for example, post-traumatic stress disorders, for soldiers coming back from the front, or they just are, they have trust issues. They can never trust, a man again, or why? Because there's these samskars, the event of being raped or being molested or having seen horrible deaths or hearing all these bombs drop have an impact on the subtle body again. The subtle body is affected. And so here we would claim that in the case of reincarnation, and I'll get to this next verse, which is very interesting, the subtle body remembers some sort of traumatic event that took place on the external outward body in the previous life, you see. And that would explain why, for example, a child has a whole different physical body, a gross body, but since he still has the subtle body around him as a soul, that subtle body somehow would manifest outwardly towards the new gross physical body in the shape, for example, of a birthmark, corresponding, for example, to the case of a bullet entry or exit, or an axe, for example, on one's forehead. And so this idea of remembering or reconnecting to a past memory is spoken by Krishna directly in the Bhagavad-Gita. Now, we'll read this verse. Granted, Krishna here is talking about spiritual memories, remembering one's past spiritual consciousness, one's devotion, one's relationship with God. But the principle also applies to, physical bodies. This is the verse in question. It's from 643, where Krishna talks about those who have fallen away from, the path of devotion to him. What happens to them, as Arjuna asks. And Krishna answers, one fallen from yoga takes birth in a pure and prosperous home, right? Or else one is born in a family of wise yogis, or transcendentalists, as Prabhupada would say. Therein, one reconnects to past life's understanding. and then strives on to perfection. So this notion of reconnecting to a past life's understanding, you see, applies to one's spiritual consciousness. And therefore, and as we see with these kids who remember their past lives, it also, in some cases, applies to a past life material understanding. For example, you have these kids who are geniuses or expert virtuoso musicians. You know, they say that Ravi Shankar, the famous sitar player, some astrologer said, suppose I heard, that, you know, he had been a sitar player for 7 lifetimes, perfecting his sitar playing 7 lifetimes in a row, which means that in each lifetime, he may have forgotten different details of his past life, but his ability as a sitar player somehow made it through to the next body. Right? Amadeus Mozart is said to have composed his first symphony. Now, a symphony is a serious work of music. I mean, it's super complex. A symphony, if I'm not mistaken, at the age, a ridiculous age of 5 or 6 or 4, I mean, some maddening age, right? Look at this following clip. This is a clip of a kid who, at the time this video was taken, is 9 years old. His name is Taj something. He's from America, or maybe from New Zealand, sorry. And at least I don't need anyone to convince me that this kid is obviously a guitar player from a past life. I mean, he's 9 years old. He's almost, you know, the guitar is almost larger than he is. And look how he plays at 9 years old. So we've established this Vedic idea of a soul remembering, connecting to a past life understanding, either a past life from, you know, a past body that one was in. But there's also, and this gets really interesting, there's this idea of a soul having a sort of a flash of clear consciousness within the womb of the mother before coming out and, you know, continuing to identify with the next physical body, and in most cases forgetting one's past material identity from one's past body. And that is described in the 3rd canto of the Srimad Bhagavatam, where there's this description of a soul inside a mother's womb who has a baby human body. Okay, that's why it's called the human soul. And that human soul, and by the way, Prabhupada, the founder of ISKCON, mentions in his commentary that some fortunate souls are able to think like this or to pray like this. So it seems like it's not something that happens to all souls while they're going into a new body, but it happens to some human souls. And here's what this fortunate human soul prays. So imagine you're in your mother's womb as a human being, right? In the placenta, literally in the womb, and you're praying like this to who? To Krishna, to God, to Paramatma, who's right next to you, actually, technically, right? The human soul further prays. The living entity is put under the influence of material nature and continues a hard struggle for existence on the path of repeated birth and death. This conditional life is due to his forgetfulness of his relationship with God. So here the soul is giving, the Bhagavatam, through this soul speaking, is giving us the explanation as to why a soul finds himself or herself in this reincarnation cycle in the first place. Whether you remember your past body or not, if reincarnation is a fact, then a natural sort of theological question comes up, is like, why am I here in the first place? Why am I reincarnating in the first place? Well, here's the clue. According to this verse, 3:31:15, the reason is the forgetfulness of the soul's relationship with God. A sort of, when you fall into coma, it's a coma. The soul is in a comatose condition, right? And so here, the soul inside this human body, inside the womb, is like, okay, whoa, now I'm remembering God. And therefore, when I come out, I'm going to take this human form seriously. I'm going to take it really seriously. I'm going to continue being connected with God, because, as you'll see in 2 verses, that connection is the key to not reincarnating again. But here in 331:19, that same soul says, the living entity in another type of body, in other words, in an animal body. He's comparing himself in a human body compared to non-human bodies. And this obviously is not a discrimination against animal bodies or non-human bodies. It's just a claim that the human body, the human incarnation, offers by far the greatest scope for attaining self-realization. The living entity in another type of body sees only by instinct. He knows only the agreeable and disagreeable sense perceptions of that particular body. But I have a body in which I can control my senses and can understand my destination. Therefore, I offer my respectful obeisances to the Supreme Lord, by whom I have been blessed with this body and by whose grace I can see him within and without. So here we have a very theistic paradigm, not just, an Atma paradigm, but a Paramatma paradigm. In other words, we don't only accept that there's a distinct soul, but that there's a supreme being, a supreme soul, a supreme creator who creates all ingredients of this material world in the first place, including the womb of the mother, including the physical bodies of all souls. And that's why he says, by whom I have been blessed with this body, right? And here's the next verse that I wanted to finish with. Therefore, here's the conclusion of this soul remembering his, pure consciousness in the womb. He says, therefore, without being agitated anymore, I shall deliver myself from the darkness of ignorance or illusion or forgetfulness, right? With the help of my friend, clear consciousness. Simply by keeping the lotus feet of Lord Vishnu in my mind, I shall be saved from entering into the wombs of many mothers for repeated birth and death. So here the Bhagavatam, the Bhagavad Purana, is giving us the clue as to, first of all, who is that supreme person? It's Vishnu or Krishna. And secondly, the clue to not reincarnating again, the clue to being saved from entering into one mother's womb after another, sometimes remembering one's past life, sometimes not. It's secondary. Whether you remember your past life or not, if there's a reincarnation cycle, that's what counts. And if there's an exit out of it, because remember, this is a small parenthesis, but neither Buddhist teachings on reincarnation, neither Vedic teachings on reincarnation speak highly about reincarnation. As a small parenthesis, Krishna talks about reincarnation as the death-wandering cycle, the death-wandering ocean, where there's 4 things called Janma, Mrityu, Jara, Vyadi, birth, old age, disease, and death, which are imposed upon the soul. And the soul wants eternal life, but is forced to be in a body that grows old and dies life after life after life. So the picture of reincarnation as a whole, as a process in general, is not painted with very beautiful light colors. On the contrary, it's described as a fault, as something that's not wanted, as something that is not desirable, right? And so here's the clue the Bhagavatam tells us, right? How do you stay free from having to reincarnate again? By clear consciousness. And what does that mean? By keeping the lotus feet of Lord Vishnu in one's mind. So here we're talking about meditating on God, right? And now we're coming to this last point about this whole process of transmigration, of how meditation on a particular type of object or person determines the kind of body you get in your next life. This is really, really important. So I'm going to say it again. What a person thinks of at the time of death is not only a culmination, we could say, of everything he or she has thought of during his whole life, but that last thought determines the kind of destination he or she will have in the next body after death. And that's why in this very famous verse in the 8th chapter, verse 6 of the Bhagavad-Gita, Krishna says, whatever state of being one remembers when he quits his body, O son of Kunti, that state he will attain without fail. So without fail. So you think of, something particular, you'll attain that state in your next life. You think of the person who killed you with an axe, then you'll take birth as a human being, who looks perhaps like that person. And you probably will remember that death experience. You think of an animal when you die, there's good chances you'll take birth in the body of that animal. Well, if you don't believe me, and if you do have some faith in these Vedic scriptures, we have as the best example among all examples, the famous story of Bharata. The famous story of Bharata as found in the Bhagavatam. I think it's in the 8th canto, if I'm not mistaken. If I am mistaken, I apologize. Maybe it's in the 4th canto. At any rate, there's the story of this Bharata. Now, who is Bharata? This story takes place over 3 lifetimes. And it's a great lesson for us in terms of, being careful about what we think of at the time of death and what we become attached to that's not essential for our spiritual development and therefore for our spiritual emancipation. So this Bharata, in his 2 previous lives, was a king called King Bharata, who was very religious, very spiritual. Towards the end of his life, he sort of, retired from active duty, so to speak, and went into the forest to become sort of a hermit and meditate on Vishnu and pray and meditate. And one day, the Bhagavatam describes, when he was going to get some water or he was next to a river, he saw a pregnant deer who was like totally pregnant, like about to give birth, sipping some water, when a tiger tried to kill her. And out of fear and shock, she jumped into the river, trying to escape the tiger. And while doing so, she had a miscarriage. She gave birth. Well, not a miscarriage because the baby deer, the fawn, survived, but she gave birth to this baby fawn. And then the deer drowned in the river and died, and somehow the tiger disappeared as well. And so this hermit, this king sage, who had been alone, living strictly in the forest, undergoing penances and austerities, all dedicated to Krishna or to Vishnu and meditation, getting ready for death, saw this baby helpless fawn, and it's described he developed some affection for it. And we could talk about, well, does that mean that if you're spiritual, you shouldn't have affection for others? No, but you should see them as spiritual beings, and they should not take you completely away from your spiritual meditation. There is a point where it does become, unfavorable. So much so that this sage, it's described, or this king turned sage, took this fawn home, became so affectionate and attached to it, and he just kind of went gaga for this fawn. And so all his, routine meditation rituals and so on were always interrupted, and always, with this fawn in mind. Is he okay? Is he thirsty? Is he hungry? When he would go away, he would take the fawn with him, he would pet him, and he just became completely absorbed in the fawn. And lo and behold, when this Bharat died, he thought of the deer at that crucial moment of death. He thought of the deer. And so what happened? Well, we saw in a few verses before, right? Krishna says, yam yam vapi smaram bhavam, etc. Whatever state of being one remembers at the time of death, one attains that state without fail. Well, in the next body, that King Bharat found himself in the body of a deer. But the Bhagavatam describes that this body was somewhat special in the sense that that deer could actually still remember his past life as King Bharata. By the way, if it would be possible to somehow do research on past lives memories of animals, that would be fascinating, wouldn't it? Because I'm sure there would be cases of animals who remember their past lives as human beings, right? But anyway, closing that parenthesis, the story continues, and this deer wasn't a deer body, but was able to remember his past life, and therefore he was frustrated. He was like, oh man, I blew it. I was so close to thinking of Vishnu at the time of death, and yet I thought of this deer, and boom, I'm in a deer body. The text describes that this deer kind of stood away, didn't get so involved with other deer, and he hung out around the hermitage of some sages. And when they were reciting mantras or reading scripture out loud or meditating or doing kirtan, he would, come really close to them so he could hear them. That's another important point, how hearing spiritual topics is so important for our spiritual development. And so the story continues, this deer died, its natural death, and took this same soul who was, King Bharata, then became this deer, then took birth in his third life as the son of a very nice Brahmin, and his name was called Jad Bharata. And he grew up in this nice Brahmin family who weren't specifically Vaishnavas, and that was one of the reasons why he figured, you know what, I'm not making the same mistake again. I have nice parents and stuff, but they're not Vishnu, they don't worship Vishnu, and so what I'm going to do is I'm going to pretend to be completely deaf and dumb. And so he pretended for years to be literally deaf and dumb. So much, and so there's stories that happened to him. He was kidnapped by some worshippers of the goddess Kali and saved. And finally, he ends up being the palanquin carrier of this king called King Rahugana. And at one point, when this Jad Bharata doesn't want to step on an ant and is questioned by the king, why are you, making my ride less comfortable? And then he gives this very beautiful, very famous series of lessons to King Rahugana, lessons, spoken by a self-realized soul. This King Rahugana, who you see here in this traditional painting, begging, mercy and blessings from this Jad Bharata, I don't know how I was ending my sentence, but there's these famous teachings from, Jad Bharata to King Rahugana, and the story ends where, King Rahugana was relieved of his service and wandered, the earth until he passed away in full God consciousness. But you see, it took him 3 lifetimes. So this idea that whatever you think of at the time of death determines your next destination is a second very important component of this process of transmigration, and as to how and why, a soul would transmigrate into another body, and in some cases, as we've seen, remember their past lives. So to conclude, I had a professor at the University of California in Riverside who would often quote one of his professors who had said that there's, when you do some research, you write a paper, you write a book, what's the big freaking deal? What's the big F deal? In other words, what's the purport here? What's the import? What's in it for you who have been listening to this for an hour and 15 minutes? What's the point? Well, the big deal is that hopefully this little journey will have increased your faith in the process of reincarnation as a scientific phenomena that happens, it seems, to every soul. As opposed to just being some stories from some Hindu mythology book. It's really something, it's a fundamental component of the universe, of the mechanism of the universe, right? And if you already have faith in reincarnation, then this should increase your faith in the Vedic paradigm. This should increase your faith in the Vedic paradigm, in the paradigm of the Bhagavad-Gita and the Bhagavatam as the model compared to the physicalist model, compared to the Christian model, compared to the Muslim model, compared to the Buddhist and Islamic model, as the model that seems to, again, provide the best fit for this rogue phenomena, which certainly doesn't fit the physicalist paradigm, right? And furthermore, this should give you at least provisional faith in this sense that, look, okay, if the Bhagavad-Gita and the Bhagavatam, when talking about transmigration of the soul, seems to corroborate empirical phenomena that seems to be, beyond doubt, then that means that part of these Vedic scriptures is true, actually corresponds to reality, right? Now, if that's true, then perhaps, and this is where, hey, why don't we have some provisional faith in something that we may not be able to have, empirical evidence for, that the other parts of the Vedic scriptures are true as well. So, for example, the declaration that there is such a place as a kingdom of God, where the soul can escape reincarnation and go to for eternal life, a place called Goloka Vrindavan, right, which is described in the Srimad Bhagavatam and the Brahma-Samhita, and where there's a supreme person, Krishna, the primeval Lord. I'll quote the Brahma-Samhita here. The first progenitor who is tending the cows, yielding all desires, and abodes in the realm called Goloka, and abodes built with spiritual gems, surrounded by millions of purpose trees, always served with great reverence and affection by hundreds and thousands of Lakshmis or Gopis. In other words, the picture, the painting we get of who is God, namely, in his most intimate sense, a young teenager, fully spiritual, but nevertheless a young teenager who's the source of everything, who's omniscient, who's omnipresent, who's all-powerful, and yet who has these very intimate, wonderful dealings with completely self-realized souls who have eternal bodies, or swarups, who are that of, eternal young girls or boys or trees or birds who have eternal loving relationships and exchanges with him in complete rapture and ever-increasing love and ecstasy. Look, if empirical evidence is out there that tends to, or that seems to greatly convince us that what Krishna says about the soul is real, then we should have this provisional faith that, hey, you know what? Maybe the rest of the Vedic revelation is also true. And to finish, we should therefore have faith in the process, which is described in these Vedic scriptures about how these truths, supposed truths, become revealed to us. And that is, we know that in this age of Kali, or we hear that above all, the process of chanting God's names as the authorized, process of self-realization for the age of Kali is the tool by which we will be able to realize all these truths, not just that of transmigration and us being eternal souls. So if we can continue just chanting Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare, we will have full revelation of the entirety of the Vedic paradigm, which, as we've seen, seems to be the best paradigm to accommodate, these rogue phenomena of, for example, children who claim to remember their past lives.